Okay, that's right. Don't forget we have our mission jars on the table. If you have any loose change, your pocket change, everybody to put that in.
We need that as well.
Not space. We need that. We really do. Again, the outlines are right over on the table, and we will start in just a moment. Outlines on the table. Can you hear me crunching? Well, welcome everybody. Glad you're here. Just a reminder before you, yes, well,
you are so ambitious. I don't know how in the world we're going to get through 8 pages.
we're not. We're not. This is also for you to take with you and just kind of read.
Okay.
We're not going to do 8 pages. No way. But I'll explain to you why it took that much just to lay this out. There's a reason for that. And it's because, first of all, we're dealing with apocalyptic language, which is always difficult to deal with. And secondly, this passage from Mark covers not only 2 different time periods in history, or in biblical or spiritual history, but then 3 different contexts in which it was written and the time it was written. And you'll understand that as we go through it. So we need to kind of expand the passage out to cover all those contexts. And I'll show it to you. And I'll get through it as quick as I can, okay? And we won't go through the whole outline. I promise you that. And there's one right over here on the table. Right over on the table. So let's bow our heads and open our hearts to the Lord as we pray. Lord, we thank you so much for bringing us here this day to study your word. Be with us and in our hearts, and bless us with your presence, that we may understand, and in understanding, we may act upon our faith to bring your kingdom into this world. Amen. All right, Mark 13:30 is one of the difficult passages, and unlike the other passages, this is more of a pure Bible study passage than, say, an interpreted passage, although there's a lot to interpret about it. And this is Jesus, and these are the words of Jesus. And just to give you a context, this takes place during Holy Week, just before he's crucified, okay, in Mark. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." Now, let's talk a little bit about why this is a problem. First of all, because this is apocalyptic language, which is always difficult. And secondly, we always assume that when the word generation is used, Jesus is referring to his generation, his time, or it just simply means, that period of time, okay? Which actually, it does. We'll talk about that. And this is where we ask the question in a passage like this, well, now wait, what generation, the generation that Jesus was a part of passed away a long time ago. The second coming of Christ has not happened. So what does this mean? What generation? Or the other question is asked, look down at E, was Jesus simply wrong in this prediction? And if so, what does it mean that Jesus was wrong? Or if Jesus was right, what have we missed? Now we've got to be careful about using wrong and right when it comes to Jesus, because Jesus was the Son of God, But we also see Jesus at times amazed and surprised. We remember the centurion's faith, where Jesus was amazed at the centurion's faith. So there's this understanding that we have traditionally in the church that Jesus knew everything at the time that he said everything. But you will learn in this passage as we study it that Jesus himself said, there's something I don't know. I do not know it. And you'll see that as we get to it. Another problem with this passage are the results of this passage. First of all, we know that because of statements like this, the early church expected the immediate return of Christ. And this affected the life of the early church. They did not start writing the Gospels for a number of years after Christ's ascension. They were at least 30 years. Why? Because they didn't think they were going to need to write anything down. They thought Christ's return was imminent. And then we go to D. It has been over 2,000 years since Christ spoke these words. And every generation of the church has taken these words literally to apply to our generation. This has had both positive and negative influence upon the church's mission in the world. So if we think that every generation has expected the return of Christ in their time, can you think of some positive and negative effects that has had upon the life of the church? Can you name any? Every church expecting that in their time, Jesus would come. What have been the positive or negative? Yes, go ahead.
Well, negative, when it didn't happen, then what is the reaction?
How do you respond to that? That it didn't happen. Yeah.
I just remember, it was like back in 1983 near Tombstone, there was this halt that thought
Yep.
it was coming on a certain date. Remember that?
Yeah.
Heard.
And I sometimes read on these forums, the political forums, people write, especially in the fundamental and the world of evangelistic world, we don't really have to do anything because this is the end of the world. Christ is coming soon. So we don't really have to do anything but just wait for it. I've read that. I think that's a negative. Yeah, Tom?
There was a book we read in Word of Life about a lady, a sociologist, who did surveys in a very conservative part of Louisiana. And the country was a wasteland because of the damage that had been done by plastics and petrochemical companies. And a lot of people had cancer because of the material
Yep.
they were
Yes.
exposed to. And they were actually in favor of abolishing the EPA because they said, why worry about it?
Yeah.
And the world is
Coming to an end.
Anyway.
It's language you hear today.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the positives of expected? Yeah.
Maybe pushes people to turn to God.
Well, it's the imminent expectation that God will return. That, in other words, we are a people who are supposed to live in expectation. What does it mean to live in expectation? What does it mean to live in expectation? Yeah.
Well, I think there's this tension between sense of urgency that we need to be about the work of God, that we ourselves need to be hungering and thirsting after righteousness, and then this idea of resting in God, that we'll leave things in His hands,
Yes.
and He's going to take care of things. But there's this tension that we
It's great tension.
live in.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And we see that manifested in loads of ways. But it is important that we remember that we are a church in expectation. But what does expectation mean? And the fact that the church is still here after 2,000 years is the positive result of a people living in expectation. If Christ doesn't come in our time, it may come in our children's time, or our children's children's time. We have something to pass down to generations. We want the word to continue. So there's a positive effect of that. Now, let's look at number 2. There have been attempts to reinterpret or soften Jesus' words or meaning to make it more acceptable to those who want to apply this passage solely to the second coming of Christ. Genea, here translated from the Greek generation, is sometimes used in the sense of race. So perhaps it is suggested the point is that the Jewish race, or even the human race, will not pass away before the second advent. The problem with that is that that's never been the way it's been used before in the Greek of the New Testament. It's never used that way. And that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, okay? Since this is as Jesus uses this passage, it is very particular to a group of people, and we'll read this later. When Jesus uses this word generation, he's always applying it every time to the people to whom he's speaking at that moment. Every time, okay? Another way is to take this generation to mean not this generation now alive, but the generation which will be alive at the time which I'm speaking. The meaning would then be the generation on earth when these things, the second coming of Christ, begin to take place, will still be on earth when they are completed. All of these things, in other words, will take place within the span of one generation. Well, once again, yeah.
One of the things I think that was common of the Old Testament prophets was that their message had an already not yet form to it. And so it was understood by the Israelites at that time that there was going to be some fulfillment in the present or the near future, and then there was going to be a longer term fulfillment.
We're going to talk about that. And that carried right over to Christianity because of what Jesus said. And also we have to remember, when these words were written down for each gospel writer. For Mark wrote these words before the fall of Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke wrote these words after the fall of Jerusalem. And that's going to make a huge difference in how Mark presents this passage, as you'll see as we read it. So let's first look at verse 30 itself. We're down at 3. Jesus begins with the words, "Truly I tell you," we know that's a very important sign. That means pay attention, everyone. I'm about to say something important. And this generation, Genea, the way Jesus uses it in this verse, clearly designates the contemporaries of Jesus. How do we know that? Because that's the way Mark uses it. Mark 8:12. "And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation.' Mark 9:19. He answered them, 'You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me.'" So, Mark consistently uses Genea to talk to the people he's with. Jesus talks to the people he's with. And we can also assume that Mark is talking through Jesus to his time. That's really important. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Jesus usually uses the term generation as a negative description of his contemporaries, which is about how the word is used, how the word is used in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. I won't go through all those, you can read them, but I point out that Deuteronomy, not one of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give your ancestors. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they do not regard my ways. Okay? So, we can see that right away, we know that the word generation is consistently applied by Jesus to those he's talking to at the moment. So that gives us the question then, what? How did this get applied to Jesus' conversation about the end of time? About second coming? How did that transform? And we're going to see that as we go through. Look at D. All these things. Jesus is speaking in response to a question put to him by 4 of his disciples. At the very beginning of Mark's chapter. Somebody read that passage in D1, if they would. So my voice won't wear out. D1 on page 2. Thank you.
Jesus is speaking in response responds to a question put to him by the 4 of his disciples. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?"
Do you hear in that final passage what Peter, James, and John asked him? Do you hear 2 questions in that single sentence? Do you hear it? What are the 2 questions?
When and what?
When, what, okay, what are they asking? What are the 2 questions that they're asking? I mean, be specific.
When will this be?
When will what be? Very good. The falling of the temple, and what's the next question? What will be, keep going.
What's the sign?
That, keep going.
It's going to happen.
All these things, which is a separate question from the temple falling. There's 2 questions here. Because, as Will so pointed out, in Jewish apocalyptic, and now switching over to Christian apocalyptic, there are basically 2 events that's being, well, let me back that up. There are just 2 historical events, both in Judaism and Hebrew Scripture and in New Testament, that are expected to happen. One is the fall of the temple because Jesus predicted that. Jesus predicted that. What in the Old Testament, it was the coming of the Messiah that was predicted. The coming of the Messiah. The other event predicted was the end of the world. And the reason that Mark 30 has been traditionally associated with the second coming of Christ is because we conflate those 2 events together. But here we see the beginning of the separation. When will this be, in answer to what he said about the falling of the temple? And what will be the sign that all these things, and we're going to find out what these things are in just a minute, are about to be accomplished. Now, remember, there are 2 historical contexts here. Jesus, this is Holy Week. So when he talks about the temple, he could be both speaking about 70 AD when the temple fell, or he could be talking about what?
His body.
His body. His body. Easily that could be interpreted that way. Mark, on the other hand, is right. Mark was written right in the middle of the time when all this tremendous turmoil was happening, leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. He was right in the middle of it. So certainly when Mark wrote this, he sat down and took these sayings and put them all together in the story in the gospel. He understood that these 2 things could happen, one right after the other, or they could happen together. The church may have even expected that, because Jerusalem had not fallen, and they felt if Jerusalem fell, Jesus would immediately return. They put them together. The early Christian church, before the fall of Jerusalem, put those 2 events right beside each other. That's what they expected. Okay? So Mark certainly reflects that understanding from his time. However, even Mark, at the end of this passage, at the end of our full passage, makes a separation between what is about to happen in Jerusalem and what could come anytime. And he does so through Jesus' own words, as we'll see. Let's look at the first expansion now. I'll read this. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. There's another reason to apply this passage, verse 30, to the apocalypse when he goes, heaven and earth will pass away, which we associate immediately with the coming of Christ, right? However, let's get back and take a look at this. Verse 28. Let's start with verse 28. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. In Hebrew, the reference to summer could be a play on words. The word for summer not only means the traditional season in Hebrew, but also means the time of harvest, which would mean the time of reaping for what has been sown. So there clearly is a completion of prophecy understanding in this image. You know that summer is near. Something that has been prophesied is about to come to an end. And then there in 28 is the image of the fig tree. The fig tree loses its leaves in the winter and shows signs of life only later, when the branches of the fig become softened by sap and the leaves sprout. Everyone knew then that winter was over. That was their sign, that winter was over. That what they had waited for in expectation was now happening. And we get this image that Jesus uses from the Song of Solomon. That's one of the sources. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing has come. And the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. Song of Solomon is gorgeous. It is beautiful poetry. Amazing poetry. In the Hebrew, it's even more amazing. It's just, I did a class on it. And some of the poetry is just, it'll knock you out. It's so beautiful. Now, we know that the Mount of Olives, looking at C here, was famous for its fig trees. And we know that Jesus did this teaching on the Mount of Olives. No question about it. During Holy Week, he taught this lesson to his apostles and disciples. He taught this on the Mount of Olives. So the fig trees would have been surrounding them. Jesus reinforces his exhortation to his followers to observe what is happening in Jerusalem and Israel at that time, that generation, and to recognize its significance. For Jesus, it would be the Passover and his death and resurrection. The veil of the temple, as we mentioned last week, was torn in two. The earthquake shook. Something had changed. And Jesus said it was going to change. For Mark, as I said before, it would be the inevitable destruction of the temple, which at the time Mark was writing was only a few years away. And here's the importance of understanding this passage. The emphasis of the image is not on immediacy. It has nothing to do with chronology, but on proximity. Not when it happens next, but what happens next. First comes this, then comes that. And there's in Mark, no chronology put on it at all. And in Matthew and Luke, and in John, there's no chronology put on it at all. First comes one event, then comes the other. But there's no, this is not the late great planet Earth, where we can sit there and date when all these things are going to happen. Mark could see it coming, but even Mark didn't put a date on it. He could see imminently that Jerusalem was about to fall. Just like any of us can see when things are building toward. In the late 30s, everyone in America, basically everyone knew there was going to be a war. They knew there was going to be a war. They knew it was coming. They could see it. Washington was preparing for it as best as they could, because the people were such isolationists at that time. So you could see it coming, so it wouldn't be prophecy to say this is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We can see it coming. So we go down to verse 29 now. Verse 29. So also, when you see these things taking place, these things, there's that word again, all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Some of you may have a different translation of that passage or interpretation of that passage in your Bibles that's a little bit different. Do anyone of you have something that's a little bit different from that? in verse 29, those of you that have Bibles, found that. Well, what it usually is, so also, when you see these things taking place, you know that it is near. It is near at the very gates, rather than he is near. There's a reason for that. The Greek is actually quite ambiguous, and taken in context, it shows that the better translation would be it is near rather than he is near. Why is that important? Because if we think of he is near, we think of Christ as the one that's returning. There again is that apocalyptic view of these verses. But if we think of it is near, an event is near. An event is near rather than he is near. So you see why one word, translated each different ways, an ambiguous word in the Greek, can change deeply the meaning of a particular passage. The event, it's not saying all these things are pointing to Christ's return, but something is coming. Something is coming. It is near. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I was wondering about, the idea of our death is near.
What's that say again?
Our death is near, that we don't know when that is going to happen.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going to happen at the end. So that when it happens, and what's going to happen. So there's that question about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Myself.
Absolutely. And we look for, people in the church all the time, look for signs that Christ is coming. But you have to do a lot of contortions to do that. I mean, you really do. I mean, I'm going to start a Bible study in October on Thursdays at 10 o'clock. We're going to have brunch afterwards, Bible brunch. And the topic's going to be Revelation. It will be filmed, too, and on our website. Topic's going to be Revelation. The first 3 chapters, I may have mentioned this to you, are a piece of cake. And after you get out to chapter 3, anything goes. And it's hard to say, okay, this is a country acting this way, this is a person acting this way. Even the definition of the Antichrist is hard. Because 1 John says antichrists, plural. Revelation says antichrist, singular. So you got to be really careful with apocalyptic language. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about the Greek being ambiguous, I was thinking that Jesus may have specifically chosen to be somewhat ambiguous.
Yes. Very good.
Because of the layers of meaning
Yes.
that he can communicate. And I think of how we admire authors who can give different layers and talk about double entendres, and we admire them for having these layers. Well, Jesus was God, and he could give a depth to his words that applied to many different things at the same time.
Absolutely.
So
And that's why it took me 8 pages to do this. Because there are layers in this passage that we have to, I kept unpacking one and then go and look at the next. Well, there's another one. So that's why there's 8 pages of this. Ridiculous.
I wanted just to look at the sign of the fig tree and how the limbs become tender and the leaves come out, and how that already not yet idea of when we become Christians and the Holy Spirit comes upon us, there is a softening to our lives.
Yes.
And God replaces that heart of stone with that heart of flesh.
Yeah.
And we become malleable in his hands.
Exactly.
But that's
And we're
only,
go ahead.
but that's only a taste.
Yes.
Because when he comes back and we're given new bodies,
Yeah.
it is going to be to a level we can't begin to comprehend.
Or imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. And we begin the process of bearing fruit. But the ultimate fruit is the fruit of the kingdom when the kingdom returns. So we do begin the process of bearing fruit. But it's your perfect way to think of that image. Exactly. Let's look at B, the phrase, when you see these things taking place in verse 29. Intentionally echo Mark 13:14. But when you see something specific, the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. How do we know immediately this is not about the second coming of Christ? What is he telling people to do? To do what? Flee to where? How then can that, why is that not about the second coming of Christ? Why?
Because if they flee to the mountains.
There's no place to flee when Christ returns.
Yeah.
There's never a call for people to flee. I mean, Jesus is actually speaking to his disciples here. He's telling them to get out of Dodge when they see the desolating sacrilege. And you know what? Most of the church did. But the church led by James did not. The church, the mother church in Jerusalem, and all of them died. All of them died. As far as we know. The Jerusalem church, centered and led by Jewish Christians, disappeared after the fall of Jerusalem. And then Antioch to the north became the center of the church. So that's what I'm saying. Jesus was literally telling them, get out of town. The desolating sacrilege is clearly the fall of the temple in the previous passage before these verses. It could also mean, in the immediate context of the time that Jesus is speaking, the events of the crucifixion. Because wasn't the crucifixion a desolating sacrilege? What happened when Jesus died around Jerusalem? What happened? Darkness? What else? Earthquakes. There was desolation. And so there's the desolating sacrilege. So it could point to desolating sacrilege, could point to Jesus' crucifixion. It could point to the fall of Jerusalem itself, which at the time Mark was writing, a desolation was going on. Yeah.
I was thinking it could also apply to the time when Paul was Saul and on the rampage.
Yes.
And he was gathering Christians
Yeah.
and throwing them in prison, and the Christians scattered. They left Jerusalem for the most part, except for that small band.
Yeah.
And they went all over the Mediterranean world, and they preached the gospel as they went. So it wasn't necessarily a cataclysmic event. It was Saul, going around persecuting the church.
That's another way to view it. And so here's what happened historically. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us basically what happened. And within the story, there were lots of desolating sacrileges. Rome came in. Well, first different messiahs emerged that told the people that that they were the Messiah, and it was time to take up arms against Rome, which a number of people did. And so Rome reacted by not only coming in, but destroying what was left of the temple after the Jewish leadership themselves set it on fire. And they threw every stone down. That would have been a desolating sacrilege. So if you look at the story, there were a number of desolating sacrilege, a number of interpretations. But this is why it's tricky to apply this to the return of Jesus. Because Jesus clearly is thinking of something specific. Mark is clearly thinking of something specific. But what are we thinking specifically about when we use desolating sacrilege? If we apply it to the second coming. You can make up a lot of stuff, but it's kind of hard to do, you know? It's kind of hard to do. So it's very inexact. Verse 31, this verse has its background in the Old Testament. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And that is why that heaven and earth pass away is grounded in the Old Testament. Look at those verses. They will perish, but you endure. They will all wear out like a garment. You change them like clothing, they pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. We see it in the passage from Isaiah. Lift up your eyes to the heavens and look to the earth beneath, for the heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment. Those who live on it will die like gnats. But my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. The reason that this is important is because it helps us to understand heaven and earth will pass away, not in the context of applying these verses to the second coming, but in the context of identifying who Jesus is. And Jesus is telling them, this is going to happen. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Because my words are true. My words are sure. This is going to happen. So it's an emphasis upon Jesus' divinity rather than connecting it to an apocalyptic event. It's emphasizing that this is, telling his listeners, this is really going to happen. This is going to take place. I promise you this. And we look back and we say, well, Jesus said Jerusalem was going to fall. It did. So can't we assume that at some point, can't we trust Jesus that Jesus will return? Because here we're sitting 2,000 years later. And a lot of people ask the question, well, Jesus isn't coming. I mean, we've been sitting here 2,000 years. And, Jesus doesn't come back with a time measurement, but says, what I tell you is the truth. Take it to the bank. Okay, let's see. Let's move on then to, let's see. How did I get to the fig trees again? Can I go backwards here? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. That's my fault. I'm moving forward. Okay. B, down on page 4. And we're getting there. We're getting there. We're halfway there. While heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, may seem to be an apocalyptic reference. It is an idiomatic expression that associates Jesus with the words of God, emphasizing not the prophecy, but the one saying the prophecy. Whatever Jesus says is certain to happen. Now, somebody read the second expansion, which takes us a little further. Okay? Who would like to read for us? Thank you.
But in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven.
And you can stop right there because we know the rest of the passage. Wow. That is clearly apocalyptic language, isn't it? Yeah.
And I just can't help but think in the ancient world, or even, long ago, every time there was a solar eclipse, people went bonkers.
Well, Helen, every word of this prophecy is in the Old Testament. Every single word. So, clearly, this was associated with the apocalypse. Suddenly, there's a section in here. And you see A underneath. In the discourse between verse 4 of Mark 13 and verse 30, this clearly apocalyptic material is interwoven with the prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem. Certainly, these words cannot be associated with the fall of Jerusalem because they didn't happen. Okay? The elect were not gathered from the four winds. I mean, again, I'm taking it from a very literal point of view. And you can use it symbolically as well. But if we look at it from a biblical scholarship perspective, this is kind of an interwoven. I told you that they all believed in two events that were coming. One being that Jesus had predicted the fall of Jerusalem, the other being Christ's return. Mark does not know. He knows one will precede the other, but he doesn't know how soon one will follow the other. Matthew changes the language completely to separate, having already seen. He uses the fall of Jerusalem in the past and then looks forward to the coming of Christ. See, it's the different times in which they were written. Some interpreters have taken this to be a highly figurative description of the divine judgments which Christians saw enacted at the Roman siege of Jerusalem. But this is unlikely. There's no evidence of that. If you're going to try to make all of this apply to the fall of Jerusalem, like we've done previously, you're going to have a problem because this is apocalyptic language from the Old Testament. This is about the second coming of Christ. Yeah.
Well, I'm still stuck back on your point you made earlier about the Lord saying that his words were true and that we could trust them. And I was thinking that I think that's part of why Jesus did the miracles and healed the sick and calmed the winds and the seas, to show that his words were true, they were powerful, and they could be trusted.
Exactly.
That what I say comes to pass. Be healed, be calm.
Yeah,
And it happened.
it happens.
And you
Creatio ex nihilo, just like God. Let there be light. Go ahead, I'm
So
sorry.
I'm just touched by that.
It is moving. It's moving.
God-
And it's more powerful than thinking of it as an apocalyptic image. It's more powerful to say, Jesus is saying, look, what I say happens. If I'm telling you this, it's true. It's going to happen. And that's good news for us. That's good news. Okay, thank you. Now let's look at C. And I don't want to go through all I've written there, but I do want to show you where these two different events are separated in Mark in his writing. Starting with the beginning of the passage. At the very beginning of Mark 13. How it begins. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, this is the bold, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, one, when this will be. This is after Jesus had predicted that the temple will fall. And two, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? See, two separate things. 1 and 2. And then Jesus responds, separating the two things. 1, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. 2, but about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So we just went into the end of the passage, all the way a little further than we had ended, because that pops in. Well, actually, that comes from Matthew 24:36. So this is from Matthew separating the two events, because Matthew's looking back now at what the fall of Jerusalem, and now looking forward to Christ's coming. That's why Matthew has a much clearer definition between the two than Mark has. Then we look at verses 24 and 25. But in those days, going back to the bottom of page 4, but in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The verse begins with a strong, I'm down in A, under verses 24 and 25. The verse begins with a strong adversative word. Adversative. Verse. But, but. Setting apart these verses from what has preceded them, the contrast can be paraphrased as, there will be false messianic figures where Jerusalem is judged. Do not be misled by them, but when the Messiah truly appears, his coming will be like this. See, at the time Mark is writing this, remember, there are messiahs, people who have risen to claim to be the Messiah of the Jews. So here is Jesus saying, you'll know when I return. You'll know. And this is what it's going to look like. And then he gives this highly apocalyptic language. And the verse in 24, in those days, is directly related to Old Testament apocalyptic literature, a phrase which is used repeatedly in Jeremiah, Joel, and Zechariah. The manner of chronological sequence is left imprecise. All that matters is that one precedes the other. Jesus declares both the sufferings that can be anticipated in the immediate future and the final triumph, which will end all suffering and resolve all paradoxes. See what we're getting at there? See what we're getting at? And again, what I just said, all of the imagery in these verses comes directly from the Old Testament, including Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Amos. So there's no question that there is this interlude of apocalyptic prediction, but it's not related necessarily to the fall of Jerusalem. It's related to these messiahs that have come forward. Claiming to be the Messiah. And what's happening in Mark's world is these messiahs are leading the people into disaster. And Mark and everyone sees it coming. Because you don't mess with Rome. In fact, how was Jesus crucified? They appealed to Rome. They said, he declares himself king. Immediately, Pilate responds to that. Immediately responds. That's what he responds to. He resists everything else. But as soon as the idea of him being a political figure emerges, Jesus going to the cross. Same thing here. These messiahs were political messiahs. They were gathering zealots around them. And that was the prelude to Rome coming in and destroying the city. Right? Yeah. So it's related to these messiahs. Okay? That are coming. And so Jesus says, no. When I return, you'll know it. That's why we don't need to guess when the Messiah is returning. Everybody's going to know it. It's not a secret. So all these cults of the second coming that emerge in Christianity that say, we see the signs now, get to the hills. Which they literally take that run to the hills literally. Which there's nowhere to run in this Christ return. Nowhere to run to, baby. Nowhere to hide. I won't sing that because you don't want to hear it. But that's why I'm saying that, Jesus makes it clear. You'll know it. You'll know it when it happens. Don't worry about it. You'll know it. Just keep moving forward.
Okay, so I have this problem with the word apocalypse. Does that mean that two things are going to happen with the apocalypse? Christ will return and the end of the world?
Well, they are always put together. They're always put together.
Definition of the apocalypse.
Always, yeah, that is the definition of the apocalypse. In Christianity, there's an end of the world understanding in most religions, but in Christianity, the two are always put together. When Christ comes, that's the end of the world. And we get that from this imagery, where Christ talks about what his returning is going to look like.
So the Christian apocalypse is the one where Jesus returns and the end of the world happens.
Well, the world as we know it ends.
Yeah.
The world as we know it. Now, Revelation obviously predicts a lot of bad stuff, right? But we'll wait for that class to talk about that. But yeah, clearly, it's when creation ends. It's where history ends. And the realized life, God is reconciled to all things. That's where that begins. Does that make sense? Yeah. They're never separated in Christian understanding. Okay. Now, look at this long passage of the third expansion. I don't want to read this whole thing, obviously, because I'll probably think. I will read the beginning, because we haven't really looked at the beginning. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large building." We had looked at this in isolation. Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when this will be and what will be the sign that all these things that you've been talking about to us are to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, think of these false messiahs, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is the beginning of the birth pangs, not the end." Yeah.
I'm struck at how easily I can look at what I see and not look through what I see to the spiritual meaning underneath. And so I see the disciples enamored
Yes.
with this giant
Yes.
temple.
Exactly.
And like, well, of course, this will be here forever.
Yeah.
I mean, look how big it is and how impressive it is.
Oh, yeah.
And we could have said that about the Twin Towers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would look at things in this world and think that this is the way it is. And Jesus, I think, was trying to communicate, get your eyes off of what you see and understand with your spirit what's going on.
What's going on?
And so Peter, chastised Jesus for talking about going to Jerusalem and being crucified.
Exactly.
What are you talking about? You're not going to be crucified. You're going to lead us into
I'm not going to let you,
a new.
I'm not going to let you do this.
And so, just
Yeah.
for me to be spiritually sensitive to what God is trying to say to me and to respond to that call.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And these verses 9 through 13, all these imagery, which we might associate, and which Christian churches associated with the apocalypse now for 2,000 years. But in Mark's time, it was related directly to what was about to happen in Jerusalem. At that time, nation was against nation. A brother was betraying brother to death. This was happening in the church itself, as what was happening in Paul's family, as they kicked him out. Children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And that was happening. And you will be hated because of my name. So I'll jump down to 9. But I want to run back to where, the end is still to come. The end is still to come. So, we can't really, I don't think Mark's intent is for us to apply these verses to our time necessarily. Although, we could certainly say that nations fought against nations. But I mean, think about it. Everybody thought World War I was the end of the world. Then along comes World War II. And everybody says it's the end of the world. Right? I mean, they really did. That was the apocalypse. Because it fit the description. Yeah.
And right now we have a lot of rumors.
A lot of what?
Rumors.
Oh, I know. Oh, wars and rumors of war. Of course, there's always wars and rumors of war. But you're right. So of course, nuclear weapons does change the equation a little bit, doesn't it? But at the same time, I don't think Mark intends us to apply these verses directly to our situation, but rather his church in his time and what he's facing. Because this was going on in the church. All these things were happening, okay? And as you look down at B on page 7, I'm sorry. Before we do that, let's look at verse 32 on page 7, there at the end of that long passage. But about that day or hour, no one knows. Now he's talking about the apocalypse. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. Here's Jesus saying, I don't know. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son. Yeah.
Well, to me, that speaks in that tension of the urgency. Keep alert.
Yes, exactly.
Be about my business.
Yes, yeah. Again, it goes back to that. This is going to happen. But don't worry about it. Because you're not going to know when. When I say don't worry about it, don't worry about the chronology. Because you don't know when it's going to happen. You have no idea when this is going to happen. I don't even know when this is going to happen. The angels don't know when this is going to happen. Only God knows this. Jesus makes that admission. And so, what does that say to us as Christians living in expectation of the return of Christ? I mean, a lot of churches, at least some in our Reformed tradition, have even given up on talking about the return of Christ. Don't even talk about it. Post-enlightenment. They don't talk about it. So, how do we talk about the second coming of Christ, considering that Jesus just said, well, and I think Willie just pointed out, well, you're not going to know the time because I don't know the time. Yeah. So how do we live with that? Yeah.
Well, I think Jesus in some parables talked about how the master servant would say, well, my master's never going to return.
Yes.
And so he mistreats the other servants.
Yes.
He eats, drinks, and he's married,
Yeah.
because he'll never return.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, don't get that attitude, because the master may return in an hour that you're not aware of. So be alert. Be about my business, because I could return at any time.
And what I learned in Reformed theology, one of the first lessons I was taught when I was studying Reformed theology about the parousia, the end of time, the coming of Christ, was this. We don't sit here and wait for Christ to come back to us. We go out and meet Christ. As the church, we go out. We, the horizon of Christ's return is approaching us. We go out to meet that horizon. That's what it means to be the church. We don't sit here and go, well, we'll just wait till the return. We'll just wait. Because that's not how Christianity is, not what Jesus intended Christianity to be. So we go out and meet Christ. That's what we do as the church and as individual Christians. We pray for the return. We want the return. People have been shocked when I've taught before. And I've said, do you realize that every Sunday you pray for the end of the world? I've had people come up to me after and go, what are you talking about? We don't pray for the end of the world. Nobody prays for the end of the world. And I go, well, you pray the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our debts, forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Thy kingdom come. Get here. You're praying for that to happen every Sunday. Every Sunday. So, now you don't have to translate that as praying for the end of the world, but for Christians, the end of the world, the end of history, is the coming of Christ. Yeah. As earth as it is in heaven. The reconciliation of the two. Yeah.
And that's the very end of Revelation. And I don't want to steal your thunder.
No, go.
Your class on Revelation.
No. Oh, don't worry. We're going to do it for like 3 years. Believe me, it won't be the third year until we get to that. Don't worry about it.
And you will have easily forgotten what I say. At the very end, it says, he who testifies to these things says, and the Lord speaking, yes, I am coming soon. And the response, amen. Come, Lord Jesus. And so
The kingdom come.
we want him to come.
Yeah. Maranatha. Yeah. Go ahead.
When I was a kid at Catholic school, we were taught to, that heaven could come in whenever, the end of the world could come whenever, that we were supposed to be good, we were supposed to love others, we were supposed to serve God. And I think that those are things that today, I still believe that those are my responsibilities right now, is to do those things, and things will work out.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think another way to look at it from a Reformed point of view is things have already worked out. That's why the temple was torn in two. That was the end of it. That was done. Salvation became a reality. Eternal life became a reality. So we are living out what Jesus did on the cross. In thanksgiving, in expectation, but in thanksgiving. That's why it was ridiculous in the early Middle Ages, or actually the Dark Ages, or in the earliest times of the church, when as I mentioned before, many people would wait till the last breath to be baptized because they wanted to enter heaven perfect.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's what they did. They waited. They wouldn't be baptized till their last breath, which was dumb because that in itself was a sin.
On earth as it is in heaven.
What's that?
On earth as it is in heaven.
I'm saying that in itself was a sin. To do that's dumb. It's just not smart. Like there's some automatic. That's the religious thing I was just talking about in the sermon. If we do this, this will happen. God will do this. God's done this. I sent you my son. What more do you want? What more do you want? Well, we want a lot of things. But and God gives us a lot of things. But we never forget that whatever we have pales in comparison to what God has already done in Christ. Yeah.
But, yes, he's given us his son, and he's given us his word and his Holy Spirit that helps us remember his words.
Exactly.
And apply his words to our lives.
Absolutely. And that's everything. What more do you want? That's it. So that whatever we may face, good or bad, by the vagaries of the world, that word still stands with us. We can be assured that Christ is there. He said, it's as certain because I guarantee it. Let's go to the end of this. I want to go down to, we're at conclusion, believe it or not. We made it. I'll read down, let's look at the bottom of 7. I want to look at 14 through 23. This entire section is to be interpreted in the light of the events which occurred in the turbulent, chaotic period of 66-70 AD in Israel. The desolating sacrilege is a mystery, but one Mark's readers would have immediately understood. It is probably and Matthew would have understood looking back. The time of Matthew's church. And Paul would have understood. The command to flee is clearly in history and not at the end of time, because there will be no place to flee when Jesus returns. The peril of flight in winter is that streams swollen by heavy rains would be impossible to cross. And that is exactly what happened in 68 AD. While the historical crisis invites a final wave of messianic pretenders, they will not be able to halt the tribulation. This will not be a time when the Messiah will intervene in history. This will not be a time yet. Jesus concludes with the admonition for his followers to be alert. Jesus' followers have an advantage. They know what is coming, and they know how to react to it. The church will be preserved through this great tribulation. Okay. And in fact, it worked for the church, because when they saw these things happening, they displaced, the Christians displaced and scattered and went into the diaspora. Right? And went into the diaspora. And that's where they, as Will said, established the world church. And finally, E, and that's verse 32, and that's what we were talking about. Beware, keep alert. Now that Jesus has applied his admonition to keep alert to the coming fall of Jerusalem, he applies the same admonition to the event that will follow the fall of Jerusalem, the return of Christ. Mark makes as much separation as is possible in his time between the two events. Jesus acknowledges that he himself does not know when God will choose to end the world. If the approach of Christ's return is impossible to discern, one can only prepare oneself for it. Nor the Son indicates that even Jesus had to live by faith and to make obedience and watchfulness the hallmark of his ministry. And that's what he taught us. Obedience, watchfulness is a constant theme. Through parables, through direct sayings, watchfulness is what we do. So, my conclusion about verse 30 is that, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. That this, in Mark, applies to the fall of Jerusalem. It is not, this generation is not some kind of, we have to understand it as, or explain it by changing the meaning of generation. I used to say, I even preached it, that, well, that's a spiritual generation, and we're in that spiritual generation. Well, we are in the time of the Spirit. Absolutely. No question. We're in the spiritual age. It began at Pentecost, and we're still in that age. But the word generation just doesn't apply. We can apply to that. If it has meaning for us, that's fine. But in the context that Mark wrote, that's not what he meant. Two events. One has happened. One is coming. And the church has been struggling to, in other words, if you apply what happened in Jerusalem to what is coming, you're going to miss something by doing so. You're going to miss something by doing so. And it's better to think of these words as this is what happened in Jerusalem, what they experienced, and then not to really apply anything except what Jesus says about living in anticipation. Be alert, be watchful. That's all he said. Still, I'm going to teach Revelations. And I'll prove to you that the end is coming on January 30th, 2040. I'm going to prove that to you at about 4 o'clock. Okay, I'll show you. We'll get ready. Get ready. It's time to flee to the hills. Find a cave. Right. I hope I'm not in a cave. I hope I'm standing out like this, going, yeah. You know, about time. So, any questions or thoughts? We're done with that. We did those 8 pages. I had to skip some, but we did those 8 pages. Did you understand why I had to stretch it out to get these contexts in? Three contexts. Jesus, Mark, and then the post-fall Gospels. 2 events. Fall of Jerusalem, the return of Christ. That's why this has to be pieced together to understand. Any questions or thoughts? All right. Well, be ready, because we don't know when this is going to happen. So everybody be ready. Let's bow our heads and pray. Lord, make us ready. And help us to understand what that means for our lives, for our worship, for our work, for the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about you. Help us, Lord, to not anticipate the hour of the moment, but to look at every moment and every hour as the time you are returning. That we not only can prepare ourselves and watch, but that we can help the world prepare and watch as well. In your holy name we pray. Amen. I think there's an important lesson also for the church. Don't dump this stuff out for the Reformed church. Don't dump it. It matters. Whereas for the fundamental evangelical, it's not the only thing. It's not the only thing. See what I mean? The 2 extremes of that? We find the middle ground. Yes, it's going to happen, but it means something in real time for us right now. Make sense? Make sense? Okay. Thank you.